Sorry about that, babe.
As a kid, I remember hanging out with my friend who recently purchased a Final Fantasy anthology on the Sony PS1. What was on that? Final Fantasy V. Yep, the one that we never got here in America on the SNES. I remember watching him play a bit, but not trying it myself. The only time that I ever really dabbled in Final Fantasy V was with one of the original translation patches, and that was maybe for, I don't know, an hour or so. I held off all these years until I decided to start chronicling the Final Fantasy series on my YouTube channel. We went through the NES version of Final Fantasy, Famicom translated versions of Final Fantasy II and III, and most recently the Naming Way patch version of Final Fantasy IV on the SNES. Well, I recently finished up my first ever playthrough of Final Fantasy V on the SNES/Super Famicom, utilizing the Game Boy Advance script port, which I will leave a link to in the description below, so here it goes. Final Fantasy V was developed and published by Squaresoft, originally released in Japan on December 6th of 1992. The rough overview, without spoiling too much, as you guys know I don't like to do that, of the story is as follows. King Tycoon leaves his castle to investigate the weakening of the Wind Crystal. The main character, known as Bartz, or Butts in some translations, or Razy in my playthrough, sees a meteorite plunge down into the ground beneath him. After investigating, Bartz finds himself meeting up with the future battlemates in Elena, King Tycoon's daughter, Galuf, an old man who seems to have lost his memory, and Ferris, a pirate captain with a few secrets. Unfortunately, the crystals are shattering, and an image of King Tycoon appears to let us know that we have to protect the remaining crystals. Luckily, the shattering of the crystals, albeit obviously the shattering leads to a greater evil making his return in the form of X-Death, also allows the crew to obtain new powers in the form of jobs and abilities. As you could probably assume, the major gimmick in Final Fantasy V is said job system. Essentially, you could view Final Fantasy V as a version of Final Fantasy III on steroids. With the jump to next gen, obviously the technical aspects are better, there are more jobs, more abilities, and more freedom in your builds, as well as probably, I guess you could say, a better put together narrative than Final Fantasy III. This expanded job system allows for great replay value and interesting choices to make along the way. The jobs include the Freelancer, which is your base starting class, the Knight, the Monk, the Thief, Black Mage, White Mage, Blue Mage, Red Mage, Time Mage, Summoner, Berserker, Mystic Knight, Mime, Beastmaster, Geomancer, Ninja, Ranger, Bard, Dragoon, Dancer, Samurai, and Chemist. Whew. So as you can probably tell, there's a lot to unpack there. Each job has its own shtick. In certain areas of the game, different jobs and abilities will come in handy, while other sections, those same jobs and abilities might be next to worthless. Now, I'll be the first to admit that there were some jobs that I didn't dabble in at all, that being the Berserker, Dragoon, and Chemist. However, I did read that the Dragoon and Chemist could have some good late-game shenanigans. Take that as you will. The leveling system in Final Fantasy V is pretty straightforward. You have your standard leveling based off of experience that's rather run-of-the-mill, but you also have job leveling, known as ability points or ABP. While traditional levels do matter and generally come with the territory even when trying to grind solely for ABP, the most important aspects of the game are obtaining new jobs and abilities that come with the job leveling system or mastering of it. Now, you could legitimately make an entire video based on the job system, but that's not really the point here. I just want to give you the overview of how it works and what it means in the game. I spent a lot of time grinding for ABP, and surprisingly, it's not that boring. Each level of job abilities scales upward with total ABP needed, so it kind of works as a ladder with very obtainable early goals leading to the longer to obtain end goals. But the way it's put together, the majority of the time I didn't mind grinding at all, and I felt like I was truly working towards something, and it was rewarding. Sure, there were some times where I probably shouldn't have wasted my time. For example, I spent a lot of time grinding Red Mage, only to really never use it much at all. I spent a lot of time with the Mystic Knight, which is a good job, don't get me wrong, it has good elemental weapon buffing abilities, but I felt as time went on it was almost better to have a team filled with brute strength, some healing, and a summoner. I guess to kind of wrap up my experience with the jobs, I'll summarize it with the following. Early game I did a lot of barehanded attacks utilizing the Monk's barehanded ability. As time went on, I shifted to said Mystic Knight, and eventually I settled for Ninja and Ranger, mostly in order to utilize the Ninja's double wield ability and eventually the Ranger's X-Fight, which would pair up to attack 8 times. Crazy, right? Eventually I obtained the secret Mime job class where, as you could expect, you could mimic whatever was done previously, resulting in the most beast job class available. All the while making sure a character or two were proficient in Thief, mostly for the sprint and flee abilities. white, black, summon, and time magic, as they are all very, very important, but I never wanted to make those my main classes, if that makes sense. I always wanted to be like a secondary thing. Again, you could go on forever about the job system, as it is the main gimmick in the game, and what would propel people for future playthroughs due to the immense build and challenge run variety that they could offer. But I'll cut it there. On a technical front, Final Fantasy V is pretty good. The graphics look nice enough, although I felt that the graphical leap was more of a slight step above Final Fantasy IV, being that it's not outrageously better than its predecessor. Perhaps the most noticeable things for me were the attention to background detail in some areas, where you could see in Final Fantasy IV, some things were potentially a little bit more vibrant, but not as detailed as it is in Final Fantasy V. The music of Final Fantasy V, as you could probably expect, is on point. Nobuo Uematsu puts together another bang-up performance that in ways in America got lost in the shuffle, considering we never got it until years after its release. Tracks such as a Presentiment, the opening cutscene theme, Cursed Earths, Walking the Snowy Mountains, Battle with Gilgamesh, and Beyond the Deep Blue Seas are equal parts catchy, atmospheric, and paint the picture of the spot or predicament that you're currently in. I feel that Final Fantasy V in some ways has some of the more overlooked tracks in the series. The difficulty of Final Fantasy V is in ways good and some ways bad. I definitely feel that it's the most difficult of the SNES/Super Famicom entries. However, the majority of the difficulty revolves solely around the boss gimmicks and job levels. Don't know the gimmick? Too bad. Oops, you didn't level up that job? Well, you have no shot here. Yes, there are plenty of bosses and enemies that you could essentially brute strength your way through, but some will require prior knowledge, and that if you had already played the game, you had already failed a time or two, or you're using a strategy guide like I did. For the record, I utilized the Final Fantasy Anthology Brady Games Guide since it was somewhat similar to the PS1 version other than naming conventions. I personally would have preferred a few less gimmick bosses and some that are perhaps just tankier, and the completionist in me died a little bit because there are 2 optional endgame bosses that I couldn't touch with a 10-foot pole, mostly because I was lacking certain rings and weapons for a particular job class that I chose not to level. You see what I mean? Basically, since I had no prior knowledge and chose not to go down a job class path, I essentially bricked myself out of these bosses. Thankfully they are optional, which obviously was done for a reason, but to me, still annoying. The pacing of Final Fantasy V suffers a bit of the same fate as a lot of the other games of this era. I feel it comes very strongly out of the gate and captures me entirely. I was ready to explore, I was ready to grind for new job abilities, so on and so forth. However, I felt as the game went on, things kind of petered out just a little bit for me. No, I did not dislike the mid or end game, it just didn't feel the same to me as the beginning did when I was once filled with wonder, awe, and had a shiny new toy syndrome, so to speak. And I gotta be honest, the main antagonist, Exdeath, is pretty cool. I like his boss design, his origin, and his backstory are pretty interesting. You'll see more when you play, I don't want to spoil all the major plot points in this review, but honestly, the actual endgame of Final Fantasy V is amongst the worst in the series thus far. You start by entering a specific realm, and in order to get there you must go through a couple of rudimentary segments and dungeons. You eventually go through an almost lazy, nonsensical boss gauntlet that has realistically almost zero anticipation or build-up. In the actual end area where you fight a sub-boss and have an OP optional boss, and the final boss is lacking. For example, the final area on the moon of Final Fantasy IV shits all over it in my opinion. And it's been quite some time since I played Final Fantasy VI, but I feel like I enjoyed the last area in that one more as well. Comparing back to the original trio on the NES and Famicom, I liked those endgame areas more too. In fact, Final Fantasy II, which is my least favorite game thus far, had one of the coolest build-up and endgame areas in the franchise through 5 games. I was really underwhelmed, and I felt like in my playthrough when I obtained my last Esper, it was kinda just like going through the motions and beating bosses. Including, I guess to be fair, probably optional, but still 6 of the same fucking boss in one of the final areas, one after the other, after the other, after the other. Oh my god, what? Why? I don't understand that. With all that being said, I did enjoy Final Fantasy V. I know it sounded like I didn't there for a second, but anyways, it has a great OST, cool atmosphere, an interesting job system, a captivating beginning to the game, tons of random Easter eggs and cute quirks, my favorite being the Windrake howl noise, whew, so cute. A very female-heavy battle party, which was pretty cool and unique for the time, some pull-on-your-heartstring moments, and so forth. It is a good RPG. However, to say that there aren't issues with it would be a lie. Mentioned issues with the general pacing, boss gimmicks, some bouts of job/ability annoyance, and a lackluster endgame knock it down a few pegs for me personally. I give Final Fantasy V on the Super Famicom/SNES an 8.25 out of 10. Yeah, I know it's a bit of an odd score for me, but I wanted to make sure that I ranked it above Final Fantasy III, which I gave an 8. But it's not quite in the echelon of 4 for me, which the retail release I gave an 8.5 and the Naming Way edition I gave a 9, just for the record. If you've enjoyed this review, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing if you haven't already. I do my best to reply to all comments on all videos, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care.